to Glimpse from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. I'm quickly recording this at the start of an episode about to go out, because when I recorded it originally I had COVID, and apparently I deleted the commentary track. The next few episodes all went up back when I had COVID. I don't actually remember what's in any of them. I know that they relate to a book called The Haunted Homes of England, and that I scoured it through for ghost stories from the Elizabethan period and before. But other than that, I'm as in the dark as you are. I presume I'll be popping in with commentary. Off on an adventure, dear listener.
The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain by John Henry Ingram. Section 6, Bisham Abbey. Read by Aidan Fitzgerald.
I did say I may be popping in with commentary. One of the characters that's about to be discussed is Elizabeth Cook. I just wanted to clarify that because of the way Aidan pronounces something, it may not be clear that when we say that her brother-in-law is Lord Burleigh, we mean William Cecil, the person who's at the very centre of the court. She was a famous poetess. She was from the Cook family, which believed that it was a Protestant duty to educate your daughters. So her brothers will skip for this, but her sisters married Sir Nicholas Bacon, so she was the aunt of Sir Francis Bacon. Her own husband was Thomas Hoby, who translated the Book of the Courtier into English. One of her other sisters also had a husband in the diplomatic service. Her own husband, Thomas Hoby, was the Queen's representative to France. Her sister's husband, Sir Henry Killigrew, was a Cornish gentleman who was, I want to say, ambassador to Scotland for a while. So she's well-educated. She comes from a family of well-educated women. She is very highly placed throughout the reign because initially she's brother-in-law to William Cecil, and then when Robert Cecil takes over, of course, she's his aunt and can get in his ear about various family matters. Listening back, I realise I said brother-in-law rather than sister-in-law. You're going to have to put up with those sorts of mistakes. My brain, it does not work today.
Bisham Abbey in Berkshire was formerly the family seat of the Hobbys, and about the first half of the 16th century was in possession of Sir Thomas Hoby, or Hoby, a man of no slight reputation for learning in those days. He married Elizabeth, the third daughter of Sir Anthony Cook, who shared the general fame of her family for intellectual qualifications. When Sir Thomas went to France as ambassador for Queen Elizabeth, his wife accompanied him, and on his death abroad in 1566, Lady Hoby brought his body home and had it interred in a mortuary chapel at Bisham. Subsequently, she married John, Lord Russell. By her first husband, the Lady Hoby is said to have had a son who, when quite young, displayed the most intense antipathy to every kind of study. And such was his repugnance to writing, that in his fits of obstinacy he would wilfully and deliberately blot his writing books. This conduct enraged his mother, whose whole family were noted for their scholastic attainments, and who, like her three sisters, Lady Burleigh, Lady Bacon, and Lady Killigrew, was not only an excellent classical scholar, but was also married to a man of literary note. That she chastised the unfortunate lad with all the violence at that period permitted to and practiced by parents on their children. She beat him, according to the old legend, again and again on the shoulders and head, and at last so severely and unmercifully that he died. It is commonly reported that as a punishment for her unnatural cruelty, her spirit is doomed to haunt Bisham Abbey, the house where this cruel act of manslaughter was perpetrated. Several persons have seen the apparition, the likeness of which, both as regards feature and dress, to a pale portrait of her ladyship in antique widow's weeds, still remaining at Bisham, is said to be exact and lifelike. She is reported to glide through a certain chamber in the act of washing bloodstains from her hands, and on some occasions her apparition is said to have been seen in the grounds of the old mansion. A very remarkable occurrence in connection with this narrative took place some years ago, according to Dr. Lee, author of Glimpses of the Supernatural. In taking down an old oak window shutter of the latter part of the 16th century, he states that a packet of antique copybooks of that period were discovered, pushed into the wall between the joist of the skirting, and several of these books, on which young Hobby's name was written, was covered with the blots, thus supporting the ordinary tradition.
This next one reminds me of a fairy story. Not a fairy tale, but one of the stories which shows up regularly. So much so that Terry Pratchett does a version of it, although it doesn't have the same terrible outcome.
Section 41 of the Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. Read by Moon Lilith. Littlecott House. Littlecott House, or Hall, as it is sometimes called, the ancient seat of the Darrells, is 2 miles from Hungerford in Berkshire. It stands in a low and lonely situation, and is thoroughly typical in appearance of a haunted dwelling. On 3 sides it is surrounded by a park, which spreads over the adjacent hill, and on the 4th by meadows, through which runs the river Kennet. A thick grove of lofty trees stands on one side of the gloomy building, which is of great antiquity, and would appear to have been erected towards the close of the age of feudal warfare, when defence came to be no longer the principal object in a country mansion. The interior of the house, however, presents many objects appropriate to feudal times. The hall is very spacious, paved by stones, and lighted by large transom windows. The walls are hung with coats of mail and helmets, and on every side are quantities of old-fashioned pistols and guns, and other suitable ornaments for an old baronial dwelling. Below the cornice at the end of the hall hangs a row of leather jerkins made into the form of shirts, and supposed to have been worn as armor by the retainers of the Darrell family, to whom the old hall belonged. An enormous oaken table, reaching nearly from one end of the chamber to the other, might have feasted the entire neighborhood, and an appendage to one end of it made it answer at other times for the old game of shuffleboard. The rest of the furniture is in a corresponding style, or was a few years ago, but the most noticeable article is an old chair of cumbrous workmanship, constructed of wood, curiously carved, with a high back and triangular seat. It is said to have been used by Judge Popham in the days of Elizabeth. The entrance into the hall of this ancient mansion is at one end by a low door, communicating with a passage that leads from the outer door in the front of the house to a quadrangle within. At the other it opens upon a gloomy staircase, by which you ascend to the first floor, and, passing the doors of some bedchambers, enter a narrow gallery which extends along the back front of the house from one end to the other of it. This gallery is hung with old family portraits, chiefly in Spanish costumes of the 16th century. In one of the bedchambers, which you pass in going towards the gallery, is a bedstead with blue furniture that time has now made dingy and threadbare. And in the bottom of one of the bed curtains you are shown a place where a small piece has been cut out and sewn in again. To account for this curious circumstance, and for the apparitions which tenant this haunted chamber, the following terrible tale is told. It was on a dark rainy night in the month of November that an old midwife sat musing by her cottage fireside, when on a sudden she was startled by a loud knocking at the door. On opening it, she found a horseman, who told her that her assistance was required immediately by a person of rank, and that she should be handsomely rewarded, but that there were reasons for keeping the affair a strict secret, and therefore she must submit to be blindfolded, and to be conducted in that condition to the bedchamber of the lady. With some hesitation the midwife consented. The horseman bound her eyes, and placed her on a pillion behind him. After proceeding in silence for many miles through rough and dirty lanes, they stopped, and the midwife was led into a house, which, from the length of her walk through the apartments, as well as the sounds about her, she discovered to be the seat of wealth and power. When the bandage was removed from her eyes, she found herself in a bedchamber, in which were the lady on whose account she had been sent for, and a man of haughty and ferocious aspect. The lady was delivered of a fine boy. Immediately the man commanded the midwife to give him the child, and catching it from her, he hurried across the room and threw it on the back of the fire that was blazing in the chimney. The child, however, was strong, and by its struggles rolled itself off upon the hearth, when the ruffian again seized it with fury, and, in spite of the intercession of the midwife and the more piteous entreaties of the mother, thrust it under the grate, and raking the live coals upon it, soon put an end to its life. The midwife, after spending some time in affording all the relief in her power to the wretched mother, was told that she must be gone. Her former conductor appeared, who again bound her eyes, and conveyed her behind him to her own home. He then paid her handsomely and departed. The midwife was strongly agitated by the horrors of the preceding night, and she immediately made a deposition of the facts before a magistrate. Two circumstances afforded hopes of detecting the house in which the crime had been committed. One was that the midwife, as she sat by the bedside, had, with a view to discover the place, cut out a piece of the bed curtain and sewn it in again. The other was that as she had descended the staircase, she had counted the steps. Some suspicion fell upon one Darrell, at that time the proprietor of Little Cot House and the domain around it. The house was examined and identified by the midwife, and Darrell was tried at Salisbury for the murder. By corrupting his judge, he escaped the sentence of the law, but broke his neck by a fall from his horse in hunting a few months afterwards. The place where this happened is still known by the name of Darrell's Stile, a spot to be dreaded by the peasant whom the shades of evening have overtaken on his way. This is the fearsome legend connected with Little Cot House. The circumstances related are declared to be true, and to have happened in the reign of Elizabeth. With such a tale attached to its guilty walls, no wonder that the apparition of a woman with dishevelled hair, in white garments, and bearing a babe in her arms, haunts that gloomy chamber.
Section 47 of The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. Read by Greg Giordano. London, The Tower. There is no place in the kingdom one would deem more likely to be haunted than that strange conglomeration of rooms, castles, and dungeons known as the Tower of London. For many centuries it has been the scene of numberless deaths by violence, some by public execution, and others by private murder, until it is scarcely metaphorical language to declare that its walls have been built out of human bones and cemented by human blood. That ghosts and spectres have haunted its weird precincts no believer in the supernatural can doubt, and, if we may credit all that has been told of it of late years, its apparitions are not yet quite beings of the past.
Here I'll break in to remove one ghost story. The two ghost stories that are being recorded here were originally written down by the Keeper of the Crown Jewels in the, I want to say, 1800s, and the first one is a thing which occurred to him, so it's not in period and it's not particularly interesting for us. I'll cut that out and pop in his second ghost story, which starts like this.
One of the night sentries at the Jewel office, records our authority, was alarmed by a figure like a huge bear issuing from underneath the Jewel room door, as ghostly a door as ever was opened to or closed on a doomed man. He thrust at it with his bayonet, which stuck in the door, even as my chair tipped the wainscot. He dropped in a fit, and was carried senseless to the guard-room. When on the morrow I saw the unfortunate soldier in the main guard-room, continues Mr. Swift, his fellow sentinel was also there, testified to having seen him on his post just before the alarm, awake and alert, and even spoken to him. Moreover, I then heard the poor man tell his own story. I saw him once again on the following day, but changed beyond my recognition. In another day or two, the brave and steady soldier, who would have mounted a breach or led a forlorn hope with unshaken nerves, died at the presence of a shadow. Mr. George Ofor, referring to this tragedy, speaks of strange noises having also been heard when the figure resembling a bear was seen by the doomed soldier.
When the soldier is said to have been willing to mount a forlorn hope, the forlorn hope is the first line of infantry used to charge a breach in a wall during a siege. They are considered to be unlikely to survive, but are given great rewards if they do. Some people volunteer and they're considered particularly brave. Others are given commutions of life sentences, for example, if they participate.
The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain by John Henry Ingram. Section 48. Lowther Hall. According to Mr. J. Sullivan in his Cumberland and Westmoreland, the latter county never produced a more famous spectre, or bogey, to give the local term.
Note the mixing of fairy and spiritual terms here. A bogey, boggart, these things that in Ars Magica, or even in Magonomia, would tend to indicate something other than a ghost. Also, at least in my equipment, this recording has some issues, so if you hear it fading out a little, it's not your gear, it's in the original signal.
Then Jemmy Lowther, well known for want of a more appropriate name, as the bad Lord Lonsdale, infamous as a man, he was famous as a ghost. This notorious character, who is described as a modern impersonation of the worst and coarsest feudal baron ever imported into England by the Conqueror, became a still greater terror to the neighborhood after death than he had ever been during his life. So strongly had superstitious dread of the deceased nobleman impregnated the popular mind that it was asserted as an absolute fact that his body was buried with difficulty, and that whilst the clergyman was praying over it, it very nearly knocked him from his desk. When placed in his grave, Lord Lonsdale's power of creating alarm was not interred but with his bones. There were continual disturbances in the hall and noises in the stables, and, according to popular belief, neither men nor animals were suffered to rest. His lordship's phantom, coach, and six is still remembered and spoken of, and still believed in by some to be heard dashing across the country. Nothing is said of the bad lord's shape or appearance, and it is doubtful whether the spectre has ever appeared to sight, but it has frequently made itself audible. The hall became almost uninhabitable on account of the dead man's pranks, and out of doors was, for a long time, almost equally dreaded, as even there was constant danger of encountering the miscreant ghost. Of late years, this eccentric spirit appears to have relinquished its mortal haunts, and by the peasantry is believed to have been laid for ever under a large rock called Wallow Crag.
So, first an apology. I thought that was an Elizabethan ghost. Clearly, it's not, because it has a coach and six, which means that it's Jacobean, at least. Quick, unplanned plug for the Carriages as Getaway Vehicles episode. I'd also note that ghosts in many Elizabethan stories are material, and that's why you can put them under a big rock. We'll come back to that in Story 108 from this collection.
Section 105 of the Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. Read by Clifford Krigo. Clegg Hall. In Robbie and Wilkinson's suggested work on Lancashire legends, to which we are indebted for some of the traditions in this volume, is an account of the Clegg Hall tragedy. The story given in the work just refers to it as the following. Clegg Hall, about 2 miles northeast from Rochdale, stands on the only estate within the parish of Wiley, which still continues in the local family name. On this site was an old house built by Bernulf D. Clegg and Quenilda his wife as early as the reign of Stephen.
It does say Stephen in the original text. It means King Stephen, who reigned about 1130 to 1150 in England.
Not a vestige of it remains. The present comparative modern erection was built by Theophilus Ashton of Rochdale, a lawyer and one of the Ashtons of Little Clegg, about the year 1620. After many changes in occupants, it is now in part used as a country alehouse. Other portions are inhabited by the laboring classes, who find employment in that populous manufacturing district. It is the property of the Fentons, by purchase from the late John Entwistle, Esquire of Foxholes. To Clegg Hall, or rather what was once the site of that ancient house, tradition points to the dim vestige of past ages, as the scene of an unnatural and cruel tragedy. It was in the square, low, dark mansion, built in the reign of Stephen, that this crime is said to have been perpetrated. One of those half-timber houses called post and petrol, having huge main timbers, crooks, etc., the interstice being wattled and filled with a compost of clay and chopped straw. Of this rude and primitive architecture were the houses of English gentry in former ages. Here then it was that horrible deed perpetrated which gave rise to stories at extent relating to the Clegg Hall boggarts. The prevailing tradition is not exact as to the date of its occurrence, but it is said that sometime about the 13th or 14th century, a tragedy resembling that of the babies in the wood was perpetrated here.
That's a misread. It's The Babes in the Wood. The Babes in the Wood is a traditional English folk story. It turns up on the Inglesby Legends. It's about an uncle who takes the charge of two children after his brother dies, and he wants to have them killed off so that he can inherit his brother's estate. He gives the children to two ruffians who take them out into the forest. The ruffians are going to kill the kids, but they argue. One stabs the other, and the other says he's going to go for food, but doesn't make it back to the children, so the children die of starvation. And the moral of the story is don't be terrible to orphans, and that murdering them's quite bad, and in some versions of the story, if you do it, weird supernatural things will happen to you that make your life a misery and kill you eventually. That's a gross simplification. English readers chastise me in the comments of the blog that accompanies the podcast.
A wicked uncle destroyed the lawful heirs of Clegg Hall and estates, two orphan children that were left to his care, by throwing them over the balcony into the moat, in order that he might seize their inheritance. Ever afterwards, so the story goes, the house was the reputed haunt of a troubled and angry spirit, until means were taken for its removal, or rather expulsion. Of course this boggart, says Mr. Wilkinson, could not have been the manes of the murdered children, or it would have been seen as a familiarity of spirits. But it was in all likelihood the wretched ghost of the ruffian relative, whose double crime would not let him rest in the peace of the grave. Even after the original house was almost wholly pulled down, and that of A.D. 1620 erected on its site, the boggart still haunts the ancient spot, and its occasional visitations were still a source of great alarm and annoyance, to which inmates were subjected. From these slight materials, Mr. Robbie has woven one of these fictions, full of romantic incident, which has rendered his Traditions of Lancashire so famous. Footnote. It is only just to state, remarks Mr. Wilkinson, that the story of Clegg Hall boggart was communicated to Mr. Robbie by Mr. William Nuttall of Rochdale, author of Les Voyageurs, and a composer of a ballad on the tradition. In this ballad, entitled Sir Roland and the Clegg Hall boggart, Mr. Nuttall makes Sir Roland murder the children in bed with a dagger. Remorse eventually drove him mad, and he died raving during a violent storm. The hall was ever after haunted by the children's ghosts, and also by demons, till St. Anthony, with a relic from Virgin's shrine, exorcised and laid the evil spirits. End of footnote. We have taken such facts only, concludes Mr. Wilkinson, as seems really traditionary, recommending the lovers of the marvellous to the work just cited for a very entertaining tale on this subject. To this meager if suggestive account of a popular story may be added that in a curious manuscript volume, now or recently, the property of Dr. Charles Clay of Manchester, Mr. Nuttall notes, many ridiculous tales were told of the two boggards of Clegg Hall by the country people. That there were two, all local accounts would seem to testify. At one time, proceeds Mr. Nuttall, they, the country people, unceasingly importuned a pious monk in the neighbourhood to exorcise or lay the ghosts, to which request he consented. Having provided himself with a variety of charms and spells, he boldly entered on his undertaking, and in a few hours brought the ghosts to a parley. They demanded, as a condition of future quiet, the sacrifice of a body and a soul. The spectators, who could not see the ghosts, had been informed on their desires, were petrified, none willing to become the victim. The cunning monk told the tremblers, "Bring me the body of a cock and the sole of a shoe." This being done, the spirits were forbidden to revisit the pale glimpse of the moon, till the whole of the sacrifice was consumed. Thus ending the first laying of the Clegg Hall boggards.
Once again, that sounds a little bit fairy to me, rather than spiritual. If you were exorcising spirits, you cast them out with powerful words and with the powers of the divine. If you are laying to rest spirits, you give them some modified version of unction, I imagine. That is, you pray them pass on to peace. Tricking them with homophones, the sole of a shoe, a little bit fairy tale.
Unfortunately, the plan of laying the ghosts, adopted by the wily priest, had not proved permanently successful. Whether the sacrifice has been wholly consumed, or the fact that the spirits of the demand, not being truly acceded to the cause, is of course unknown. But for some reason or other, the two ghosts continue to walk, and the belief in their appearance is as complete and as general as ever.
Section 107 of The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain, Cumnor Hall.
This one's been recorded by Alan Mapston, by the way. Cumnor Hall is very important for Magonomia players because this is the JFK magic bullet big conspiracy theory place where people say Queen Elizabeth put out a hit on Robert Dudley's wife, or Robert Dudley put out a hit on Robert Dudley's wife, or she was ensorcelled to throw us off down the stairs, or something like that. So the Amy Robsart we're meeting here is Robert Dudley's wife, and she is the impediment to him marrying the Queen. Robsart is her maiden name, which is a little confusing. It's not one that she personally kept, so I'm not sure why it's being used here, possibly because during the Elizabethan period everyone has the same name.
Cumnor Hall was a large quadrangular building, ecclesiastical in style, having formerly belonged to the dissolved monastery of Abingdon, near which Berkshire town it was situated. It has acquired a romantic interest from the poetic glamour flung over it by Mickle in his ballad of Cumnor Hall, and by Sir Walter Scott in his novel of Kenilworth. Both authors allude to it as the scene of Lady Amy Robsart's murder, and, although the contemporary coroner's jury pronounced the lady's death to have been accidental, and modern antiquarians endeavour to exonerate Lord Robert Dudley, afterwards Earl of Leicester, from having had any hand in his wife's tragic end, the matter is still enveloped in mystery. According to the evidence given before the coroner, Lady Dudley, on Sunday the 8th of September 1560, had ordered all her household to go to a fair then being held in Abingdon. Mrs. Oddingsale, her companion, had remonstrated with her for this order, observing that the day was not a proper one for decent folks to go to a fair. Whereupon her ladyship grew very angry, and said all her people should go, and they went, leaving only Lady Dudley and 2 other women in the house. Upon their return, the unfortunate lady was found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs, but whether fallen by accident, or through suicide, or flung there by assassins, is, seemingly, an unfathomable mystery. Sir Walter Scott, taking Mickle's ballad for his authority, assumed that a foul murder had been committed, and in his romance of Kenilworth gives the following dramatic but purely imaginative account of the affair. Lady Dudley, miscalled the Countess of Leicester, is described as imprisoned in an isolated tower, approached only by a drawbridge. Halfway across this drawbridge is a trap-door, so arranged that any person stepping upon it would be precipitated below into a darksome abyss. Varney, the chief villain of the novel, rides into the courtyard and gives a peculiar kind of whistle, which Amy recognises, and, deeming her husband is coming, rushes out, steps on the trapdoor, and falls headlong down. "Look down into the vault," says Varney to Foster. "What seest thou?" "I see only a heap of white clothes like a snowdrift," said Foster. "O God, she moves her arm. Hurl something down upon her. Thy gold chest, Tony, it is a heavy one." The imputation of this terrible crime, derived by Scott from Mickle, was obtained by the latter from Ashmole's Antiquities of Berkshire, the compiler of which work is said to have found the accusation against Lord Dudley in a book styled Leicester's Commonwealth, a publication published in 1584, 4 years before Dudley's death, and publicly condemned by the Privy Council as an infamous and scandalous libel. It is interesting to know that Amy Robsart, who is believed to have been born at Stansfield Hall, Norfolk, a house which obtained a fearful notoriety some years ago as the scene of the murder of Germines by Rush, was married publicly at Sheen in Surrey on the 4th of June 1550, instead of clandestinely as generally stated. King Edward VI, then only 11 years old, kept a little diary, preserved in the British Museum, and, says Canon Jackson, to whom we are indebted for much of the information given here, therein alludes to the marriage in these terms. 1550, June 4th. Sir Robert Dudley, 3rd son to the Earl of Warwick, married St. John Robsar's daughter, after which marriage there were certain gentlemen that did strive who should first take away a goose's head which was hanged alive on 2 cross-posts. Although the jury and Lady Dudley's relatives agreed to accept the poor woman's death as accidental, the country folk about Cumnor would not forego their idea that foul play had been resorted to. Ever since the fatal event, the villagers have asserted that Madam Dudley's ghost did used to walk in Cumnor Park, and that it walked so obstinately that it took no less than 9 parsons from Oxford to lay her, that they at last laid her in a pond called Madam Dudley's Pond, and moreover, wonderful to relate, the water in that pond was never known to freeze afterwards. Notwithstanding the laying of Madam Dudley, however, her apparition still contrives at intervals to reappear, and he is a brave or foolhardy man who dares to visit at nightfall the haunts of her past life. Mickle's ballad is still applicable. And in that manner now no more is cheerful feast and sprightly ball, for ever since that dreary hour have spirits haunted Cumnor Hall. The village maids with fearful glance avoid the ancient moss-grown wall, nor ever lead the merry dance among the groves of Cumnor Hall. Full many a traveller oft has sighed, and pensive wept the Countess's fall, as wandering onward they espied the haunted towers of Cumnor Hall.
Section 108. The De Burgh Castle. Read by April 6090.
And here I'm going to pop in to say I only want a couple of lines from this story to demonstrate a point.
On his arrival at the castle, as he was passing up the stairs, he heard a footstep behind him, and on turning round, he perceived the same apparition. He hastily entered his room, bolted, locked, and barred the door. But, to his horror and surprise, these offered no impediment to his ghostly visitor, for the door sprang open at his touch, and he entered the room.
And there we are. Like most ghost story readers, I was expecting the ghost to just fade through the door and furniture. But no, instead, the ghost is a physical object in the Elizabethan period, and the door magically unlocks itself. The furniture piled up against it magically shoves itself aside to allow him entrance. He doesn't fade through the wall. I meant to stop at half an hour, but this seems like a strange point, so we'll have one more story.
The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain by John Henry Ingram. Section 118. Heath Old Hall. Read by Greg Giordano. There are 3 halls at Heath, near Wakefield, but the one known as the Old Hall, at present occupied by Edward Green, Esquire, is that which bears the reputation of being haunted. It is a truly magnificent and palatial pile of buildings, and has been well described to us as one of the finest specimens remaining in Yorkshire of the Elizabethan period of architecture. The hall was built for John Kay of Dalton. The windows were formerly emblazoned with the arms of many of the chief nobility of England, but these have disappeared, such painted glass as there is there now having been brought over by some nuns, with whom, it is said, was a princess of Condé, who resided at the hall during the revolutionary troubles abroad. Mr. John Batty, to whom we are indebted for much of the following information, says the Kays were succeeded in possession of the old hall by William Witham, Esquire. This owner died in 1593, and it is not improbable that some peculiar circumstances which attended his decease and death first obtained for the place its curious reputation. His illness and its fatal termination were ascribed to demoniacal agency, and a poor woman of the neighborhood, named Mary Pennall, who lay under the suspicion of being a witch, was arrested and executed for the supposed crime at York. William Witham's son Henry dying without issue, Heath Old Hall became the property of his sister Mary, wife of Thomas Jobson of Cudworth, whose family had grown rich upon the plunder of abbey lands, another very potent reason for an uncanny fame being acquired by the race. Her first husband dying, Mary took for a second Thomas Bowles of Osberton, Nottinghamshire. Mary Bowles, whether for her loyalty or wealth is not stated, was created a baronetess of Scotland, with remainder to her heirs whatever by James I. in 1635. If not a solitary, still a very rare instance of such a title having been conferred. Lady Bowles lived in great state at the old hall, and, after much wealth and prosperity, died there in 1662, when 83. Her interment did not take place until 6 weeks after her decease, she having assigned £120, a very much larger sum then than now, for keeping open house for all comers during that time. Her will, only signed the day before her death, besides containing a number of charitable bequests, legacies to relatives and friends, and £200 for the erection of her tomb, further provides for the funeral festivities as follows: I give all my fat beeves and fat sheep to be disposed of at the direction of my executors,
And we go back to the King of Elfland's Daughter episodes with a reminder that beeves is an old-fashioned word for cattle, literally things made of beef.
Whom I charge to perform it nobly, and really to bestow this, my gift and good provision, 2 hogshead of wine or more, as they shall see cause, and that several hogsheads of beer be taken care for, there being no convenience to brew. And my bedding being plundered from me, I desire that the chambers may be well furnished with beds, borrowed for the time, for the entertaining of such as shall be thought fit lodgers. Besides these arrangements, Lady Bowles left £700 to be expended in mourning, and £400 for funeral expenses, and charged her executors most earnestly to see her will exactly performed, adding that if any person interested in it obstructed them in any degree, he or she should forfeit all claim to any benefit from it. The old hall fell to the share of Sir William Dalston, in right of his wife Anne, daughter of Lady Bowles by her second husband, but, after changing hands more than once, passed by purchase to John Smith, Esquire, of Heath, from whom it descended to Captain Smith, of the Grenadier Guards, its present possessor. The hall and its environs, says Mr. John Batty, are beautifully described as Emilia Monterio, a ballad by Mr. W. H. Letham on a young Portuguese lady who lived with the nuns when they inhabited the hall some 60 years ago. But the grand feature about this magnificent old hall is that it is haunted, and by the apparition of Lady Bowles. Her ladyship is said to walk and disturb the neighbourhood, but her favourite resort is a fine banqueting room, with a splendid carved stone chimney-piece, upon which are the Witham arms. Hunter, the Yorkshire antiquarian, deems that the lady's restlessness in the grave may probably be connected with the romantic circumstances surrounding her father's death, whilst others think it due to the non-observance by her executors of certain clauses in her will. According to this latter account, the lady long walked in Heath Grove, till at length she was conjured down into a hole of the river, near the hall, called to this day Bull's Pit. The spell, however, was not so powerful but that she still rises and makes a fuss now and then. A tradition, however, exists in Heath that a room in the edifice which she had walled up for a certain period, because large sums of money had been gambled away in it, was opened before the stipulated time expired. Hence the restlessness of Lady Bowles. At any rate, even nowadays she is reported to be seen sometimes gliding along the passages of the house she once inhabited in the flesh, whilst servants in a neighbouring residence have refused to go out after dark, as they have repeatedly seen at dusk a tall woman dressed in antiquated style in the coach road of Heath Old Hall. One correspondent, as evidence of the general feeling of the neighbourhood about this time-honoured apparition, informs us that when at Ledsham, some time since, he was looking over the tomb in the north chancel, beneath which Lady Bowles lies buried, when 2 little lads whispered to him, "Don't go there, master, there's tall Lord." Anglesey, the devil.
So, dear listener, as we are deep into the second of the 3 volumes of Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain, I think we'll pause there and come back to it next week. Your saga may vary.